Guests that we may have here tonight. As we have our very simple agenda, there's 2 items tonight, but to recognize in part Littleton's incomplete, and we have a chance to strive to get more done. And as we go through tonight, part of it is along the theme of learning who we are, and part of it is visioning for our future. And with that, introducing Elizabeth tonight is our Deputy City Manager, Mike Broughton.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor, Mr. Nanick. Mike Broughton, Deputy City Manager. With us tonight is Elizabeth Gardner. Michael and I had talked when we first started thinking about this visioning concept that, or this visioning plan that we're going through tonight, that it'd be nice to provide some context, some kind of where we have been and where we're going, and allows you to kind of think about that as well as when you think about the city as to where we have been, where we are today, and where we will be going. So along with that, we have Elizabeth Gardner. She is the state demographer for the state of Colorado out of the Department of Local Affairs. So we have dignitaries here this evening. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more, but Michael and I actually saw a presentation of hers at the the Metro City Managers Association, and thought it'd be perfect for you guys to see as well. So with that, I'll give it to Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your program tonight. And we'll see if we can get this connect to printer to stop coming up. I don't know why it keeps doing that. All right. So again, my name is Elizabeth Gardner. I'm with the State Demography Office, State Demographer for Colorado, and what we do in our office, demographics, often we get compared to actuarials, but we basically look at the components of population change, what leads to population change within the state. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about what we see as trends for the state, how the Denver metro area fits into the state, and basically how does Littleton fit into the Denver metro area.
Oh, they're in my office.
Definitely ask questions. This is for you. I'll leave the presentation with Mike as well. And if there's further questions, if there's stuff that's not here that you're interested in learning more about, definitely ask, and we can make sure that you get that as well. I think it's always nice to start with a little bit of information of how big is everything else and where do we fit into the big picture. So starting at the U.S. as a whole, the U.S. population is right around 316 million. Between 12 and 13, it increased by 2.2 million, or about 0.7%. During that same time, Colorado increased by 78,000. It was a 1.5% increase. So quickly we can say Colorado increased about twice as fast as the U.S. as a whole. The U.S. increased by 0.7, we increased by 1.5. We are then the fourth fastest in percent change, growing by 1.5%, behind North Dakota, Washington, D.C., and Utah. Fifth in absolute change behind Texas, California, Florida, and North Carolina. So really, big picture, we're kind of at the top of the heap in terms of population change between 12 and 13 compared to Colorado, compared to the U.S. as a whole. Which is kind of interesting to see because within the state, we had counties increase by 14,000 as well as decline by 680. We had an increase of over 3%, so twice as fast as the state as a whole, as well as a decline of 4%. So when we look at the state as a whole, red, orange, yellow are counties that increased in population. Blues are counties that have declined in population, and I'm looking at the time period from 2010 to 2013 to get a kind of a bigger time period. We can see that most of this change that's occurred in the state has occurred in the Front Range, not really around the periphery, and in fact we have several counties that have declined in population even though Colorado is ranked in the top 5 in terms of total change. It insists in making me go to a printer. top. All right. When we talk about population changes, this is an important piece then to start thinking about for Arapahoe County and Littleton, is it takes two pieces to change. You've got net migration, which is the green piece, which is people moving in versus people leaving, and natural increase, which is the orange component, which is births minus deaths. So this is looking at it for the state as a whole from 2000 through 2012. And you can see definitely toward that end of the 2000s or beginning of the 2000s, end of the 90s, we were definitely increasing more because of net migration. Then during most of the recession, you can see that it was about even pace between natural increase and net migration. What does it look like for Arapahoe County? Same idea. On the bottom part here is natural increase, and then on the top is net migration. Net migration. Why?
Can you try clicking on the other council? At the upper one? Yeah, that make a note. Is that ours, Mike?
Go to the printer and delete it.
I know, it wants to
Frisbeed
connect.
out the
What's
door,
funny
that's
is that
what
I
I
never
do.
connect to the printer at my office. This is only a to-go machine. So when we look at net migration, I think it's always interesting to see what kind of people do we attract to an area. And this is net migration for Colorado as a whole by age. So what kind of folks do we attract to Colorado? Youngins.
30s.
25 to 35-year-olds, or basically 22 to 37-year-olds for the most part. The line is at 65, and you can see the lion's share. But it's important to know that most migration occurs at the young age anyway. This is the largest share of movers tend to be at that 25 to 34. If we then compare Douglas, Arapahoe, and Denver, it gives you a little bit different perspective in terms of the type of people that we attract to the area. Denver's in the green line, and it is definitely oriented toward the young population of the 20 to 30-year-olds, loses the very young as well as their parents. If we look at Arapahoe County, we can see it's a little bit older population that it attracts, all the way positive through 47, 48, and then kind of goes negative all the way to 75 and comes a little bit positive, where then Douglas County attracts an even older aged population and increases at these pieces. And so that's important to know because, again, where does Littleton fit into the picture? We need to know, how is Colorado changing? What kind of folks does Colorado attract? Because Littleton's not going to get them if they don't come to the state to begin with. And then what age group, for example, does the county get? And then how will potentially Littleton fit into that picture?
Going back a slide, Elizabeth. Just as you were saying, Denver loses the young and their parents, Arapahoe and Douglas County are gaining the young and their parents.
Absolutely. And we've seen that over time, that Denver tends to be a first place of attraction and attraction of the young. Then they try to have kids and family, and they're like, maybe I'll go somewhere else because maybe schools are better, maybe housing's cheaper, maybe I feel safer, all of the other reasons why people have continually moved from the city center to the suburbs. When we then look at Littleton's population over time from 1990 to 2013, we can see that it increased by from about 33,000 to about 43,000 over that time period. Recently, I think it's interesting to look at from 2010 to 2013, population increased by 1,700. That's about a 1.4% increase. Interesting, it's very relative to the state's population growth during that same time period. The part that I think is cool, and this is always what I want to be able to verify with the city, is housing unit count during that time only really increased by about 24 housing units according to our records, but we want to improve that if that's wrong. But you can see how the population increased. You can watch vacant housing units decline. You can watch then the vacancy rate decline to a vacancy rate that is actually incredibly low, and low in the metro area. Granted, the entire metro area has a pretty low one, but it's one of the lowest for most cities.
I keep wondering how they come up with that vacancy rate and where those numbers come from, if it's a sampling or if it's what exactly is it based on?
So the vacancy rate, we start with Census 2010, which is then a complete census of the population. Then what we end up doing is we look at that persons per household, we apply it to population change. So for example, if Arapahoe County increased by 1,000 people using birth and death data, as well as migration data by IRS, we then allocate it to each of the municipalities and unincorporated based on housing unit change. So even if you didn't have housing unit growth, you would still get added people because we're taking the entire population and allocating it down to its piece. But we use persons per household, we hold that fairly constant over time, and then we allow that vacancy rate to fluctuate.
Thank you.
So this is basically a computed vacancy rate. Any other questions on that? So anyway, I thought that was kind of fun to look at, that change over time, because not all cities have gone this direction. I'm actually giving a presentation in Englewood Thursday, and they declined in population. Their vacancy rate hasn't changed as much compared. And you guys are, relatively similar sized cities. So it was interesting to just kind of play with it and see how that had changed.
Elizabeth, you can tell them that we're much larger.
So population by age, this is another piece that I think is really important to look at. If we look at the change in population by age between 2000 and 2010, the dark bars is 2000, the light bar is 2010. The red line looks at percent change. Now, the red line scale is over here. The 0, it goes right around here or just a little bit under that 3,000 mark. And we can see the red line is mostly below that level all the way up until 45 to 54. That means over this time period, you declined in population in almost every age group younger than 45 to 54. So you have about the same under 5. You have a little bit fewer 5 to 9, a lot fewer 10 to 14, 15 to 19, a little bit of an increase of the 20 to 24s, relatively flat on the 25 to 34, but look at that decline in the 35 to 44. And you have to think about, what did 35 to 44-year-olds do? And what do they have children? Because that can explain, if you had a decline in the 35 to 44-year-olds, also help to explain why there might be a decline in the kids. Now, is it that they moved out, or is it that they had birthdays? Because there's two ways you can decline that population 35 to 44. You can move out, or you can move into that next age group. And that's a lot of what I think I see is this growth in the 45 to 54, but then look at that growth in the 55 to 64. But not that much of a growth in the 65 plus, granted an increase, but interesting with Littleton, the share of your population 65 plus is 15%. The share for the state as a whole is 11. So on average, you are a little bit older city than the state as a whole. And if we look at it then comparing Colorado, Littleton, and Arapahoe County, this is population by age in 2010, and this is the share of the population. We can see that you have a little bit fewer on the young end, but then you have a relatively larger share on that, basically starting at like 50 forward, a larger share of your population in that older age group. So this is all important to know about types of services, types of housing, potentially health services, education services, roads, anything that might be related to age. You can see the difference in the city compared to the area that it's in.
So would this chart support the idea that from middle age on, people choose not to leave Littleton, they'd rather stay. Because that tends to be what we believe, but I don't know that numerically, or on a scale, I've been able to see it as clearly as maybe that.
So that's a really good question and segues nicely into here. What we know about movers in particular is that they move, for the most part, at these young ages of 20 to about 30. Then the move rate slows down. You get a little bit of a bump, typically in the 55, 65 plus, where people will make a move. But they're relatively stable, and most people, will age through a time period. And so if you had at one point a lot of 35 to 44-year-olds, they liked Littleton, next decade you're going to have a lot of 45 to 54-year-olds. And if they still dig it, then you're going to have a whole bunch of 55 to 64-year-olds because they're aging in place. At that same time, though, you have to think about, do you have a fixed housing stock? If that is the case, and people age through time, then you could see, and we've got other examples of metro cities, where you're young, you find another young person, you get together, and then you have more young people. So all of a sudden you're a household of 4. You love it, you stick around, they age out of the household, then you become a household of 2, or maybe 1. Your housing units haven't changed, but your population has declined because you went from a household of 4 to maybe a household of 2 or 1. But then you decide to move on, another young family moves into that housing unit, and you start that cycle all over again. So on this one, it's interesting to look at movers. This looks at all movers into Littleton by age. And what we can see is the largest share of the movers into Littleton are young. They're the 25 to 29-year-olds. And about 50%, a little over 50% of all of your residents have been recent movers. So the red line represents the share of that population that recently moved into Littleton. And so we can see at the older age groups, yes, there's fewer of them moving in, but it's also a smaller share. Like you saw before in terms of your age, you've got, it's almost your largest share of your population is 65 plus, very close to that 45 to 54-year-olds. Yet, when we look at movers, they're a very small piece, and recent movers are only about 10% or less of the population. Household types, again, because the population didn't change a lot, your household formation and household types did not change a lot between 2000 and 2010, but you can see that you've got a decline in families, households with children under the age 18, an increase of non-family households, meaning not related to anyone, so either living as a roommate or living alone, and actually living alone is the largest share of non-family households. So you could see that family of 4 becoming a family of 2, becoming a family of 1, and that's where you see a lot of that change and an increase as well in the non-family household 65 plus living alone. And that might be something that you watch over time, because as you have an increase of 65 plus living alone, you might see the additional need for services in your community. In terms of household income, I just did a quick comparison between the Denver metro area and Colorado as a whole. A little bit lower median household income than the state, a little bit lower than the Denver metro area. Green is Littleton, blue is Denver metro, red is Colorado. You can see that the largest share of households are in this 50 to 75,000 mark, but just it was kind of a way to compare where you stood in terms of other communities.
Elizabeth, before you leave that one, because that's I've seen that statistic before, and so when folks are looking at this household income, what's included in that and what's not included?
So this is a really important piece. Because of your share of the population 65 plus, it does not include wealth. This is basically household income. It includes both earned income and unearned, but it does not include savings or investments. So you saw your large share of the population 65 plus. You can also see a larger share of income at the lower end. Typically, your retired family is going to have a lot less earned income. And if you're living off of savings or investments, that won't show up in this piece. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I meant to mention that. So it's really important to look at this. This is only looks at income. Then if we look at, I was trying to come up with another way to think about showing some data for Littleton. So Littleton here, surrounded by the other municipalities or places. This is looking at median home value. And again, you can see that very similar, or at least in the same category as your neighbors, with a little bit higher to the south and a little bit higher over here. If we then compare and look at your median value of occupied housing units as well as rent, we can see that you actually have a really nice distribution. You've got a little bit in all areas with a nice set right here in the middle. Same with your median rent. Any questions on this? And these are all tables that you can quickly pull from our website. So as you're looking at doing any new things, I mean, granted, I would always be happy to pull it for you, but these are just really quick things that you can pull up and look at.
Yeah, the footnote to the home value, particularly when you relate it to Highlands Ranch, is that our square foot value is higher
Than theirs. Oh, that's, and I haven't even thought about, that's an interesting.
Yeah,
That down.
and there was in the paper today, very, very favorable to us, the median value compared to, I think, about 6 or 7 metro communities. And we were first or second in that median. And I'm trying to remember, it was on an article on Aurora, I think. Pardon?
It was Urbana.
Urbana. I knew it was an A, thank you. Do you remember more about it?
It was more about building permits, but it did show value was highest in about the 7 cities.
I pulled some information as well on educational. Do you want me to go back? Oh, you're good. Okay. On educational attainment and looking at where you compare to Denver Metro and Colorado as a whole, very important to see higher percent high school graduation or higher, as well as bachelor's plus, higher than both the state and the Denver Metro area as a whole. Another piece to look at that I thought was interesting is what does it look like in terms of your commuting patterns, in terms of your jobs and your residence. So this diagram shows the dark colored green are your jobs, the light colored green are your residents. And so what you can quickly see is that you've got more jobs than you have residents. So employment in the area, now granted you're going to look and say, no, our employment's this. This is just gives you a relative feeling. This is using a Department of Labor data from 2011, and it only includes wage and salary data. It does not include any proprietor information at all. But it gives you a relative sense. So again, looking at a much larger jobs, so about 29,000 versus residents, about 17,000. And interesting is that very few work together. You've got, in terms of employed and living in the area, it's only about 8% of the jobs. And in terms of living and employed in the area, it's only about 13%, 14%. And so in terms of going forward, you could understand in terms of commute patterns, road miles, that basically most of your jobs aren't filled by your residents, and most of your residents leave for jobs elsewhere, which you probably knew, but it's always kind of nice to look at the picture. In terms of looking at your share of jobs compared to types for the Denver metro area as a whole, a couple of things that I just noted real quick: a larger share of retail trade jobs than the state as a whole, a larger share of manufacturing, a little bit higher in healthcare and social assistance compared to the state, or compared to the Denver Metro. But just another way to kind of do a quick comparison between jobs in Littleton compared to the metro area. So what are we looking at in terms of trends and how may they affect this area? We are looking at growth in both high-end and low-end service jobs for the state as a whole, a lot of that related to aging. We definitely consider this a transition decade in terms of the aging and the impact here. Incomes, as we'll talk about, incomes are influenced by both economics as well as demographics. And right now we're definitely going through a time period where our incomes are kind of demographically challenged. As we kind of looked at that one chart showing that incomes for Littleton show at that lower end, primarily because you've got a larger share of that population, 65 plus. Maintaining economic and amenity advantages, I think, is going to be an interesting piece to follow over time. As I'll mention with the aging, things are going to become more and more competitive. And we need to see how competitive is Colorado, how competitive is the Denver metro area, and how competitive is Littleton to continue to attract the best and the brightest going forward, because everyone will be dealing with the same issues that we're dealing with. As I'd mentioned, jobs are a huge impact of net migration to an area. This just shows jobs over time compared to net migration, and you can see that correlation between job growth and net migration. We're forecasting the state as a whole to increase from about 5.2 million to about 7.8 million by 2040. If we look at it then a different direction, this shows most of the growth is going to be occurring along the Front Range. I call it the bookends, with Weld and El Paso both increasing over 300,000. But Arapahoe, as I'll show in the next slide, will be increasing. It's almost at that 300 level as well. But the Denver metro area as a whole increasing by 1.2 million over that time period. And if we look at that forecast increasing from almost 600,000, about 570,000 in 2010, to about 850,000 by 2040 is the forecast for Arapahoe County.
Earlier in one of your slides, Elizabeth, you showed even though Arapahoe County is growing, it actually trails off at the older ages, and it almost seemed like there was a decrease in the older population at the county. Do you have a projection, as you're looking forward to this, what population that might be to subsegments within Arapahoe County by age?
Yes, we've got the whole forecast for Arapahoe by age, and the slide shouldn't have given the implication of a decline in the older population. It might have been looking at a current status or share of movers.
It was the 2010 to 2013 component particularly.
Oh, and that was just your total population. That wasn't an age piece at all, I don't think. I'll go back. I will go back to that one, but let me go through this and maybe we'll answer it at this point. Because we don't actually forecast any decline for Arapahoe County at any age group. And in fact, growing at all age groups. Kidding me. So what does Littleton's forecast look like? Well, we don't do forecasts by municipality, primarily because it's really dependent on housing unit plans and what your build-out plans are. And that's stuff that we don't know about. We know what the forecast is for Arapahoe County, but not really anything dealing with Littleton. And it will obviously be dependent upon Colorado's growth, the Denver metro area growth, housing unit plans, housing unit types, single family versus multifamily, the diversity of size and price, as well as how well you attract and retain your current population, and a whole bunch of other constraints I probably have no information about. So I have no information on your forecast, but I do want to talk about why we are getting old so fast, because you've got a perfect population here, and I know I've been working with Kay Wilm,
We'll measure.
looking at that piece for your population. Because you've got a great set of population right now that's kind of 45 to 64. And if all goes well, then you're going to become your 65 plus population. So why is it so big in Colorado? One, we just have very few people over the age 65 in the state. Fourth lowest in all of the U.S. in terms of share of our population over 65. We've got a lot of boomers in the state, 1.3 million. And by 2030, that population, 65 plus, will increase by about 125,000, increasing from about 555,000 to 1.243 million just from aging. Again, you saw the migration. We don't migrate people here over the age 65. So the only way we are really increasing this population is birthdays. So it's all good. Birthdays are good. But we will be transitioning from a relatively young state to still relatively young, just a little bit more average maybe. When we're looking at our change in population, our fastest growth period is between 2010 and 2020, increasing by 61%, and we're already in 2014. I almost said 2013. Followed by another decade, increasing by about 40%. If we look at that for Arapahoe and Douglas County, I wanted to throw in a comparison. This is your 65 plus population in Arapahoe County, increasing by 71% between 2010 and 2020, followed by increasing by 45%. So increasing faster than the state as a whole in that 65 plus population for Arapahoe County. And you can see that obviously Douglas is going to be going through some changes as well, but they're much smaller in terms of population, especially that 65 plus. So this just is another way to look at the comparison, looking at 1990, 2010, and 2030 population by age, and we can see the baby boomers, they're having birthdays. This is 2010, they're reaching 65. By 2030, all of the boomers will have turned 65. So why do we even talk about it? Oh, and actually one of the things I wanted to mention here, when I was working with Kay, so currently Littleton's population 65 plus is about 6,500, a little bit more. If we think that it's going to grow, basically birthdays, increasing about 60 to 70% over the next decade, you could have then a population 65 plus somewhere between 10,500 to 11,000 just from aging. And that's by 2020. By 2030, that population could be 14 to 16,000 just by birthdays. If you take your current population and you allow them to age, and then a couple of them don't make it, because we don't, that's just things happen. It could be as large as 14 to 16,000 by 2030, increasing right now from about 6,500. So something definitely to keep an eye on. Why do we even talk about it? All of these factors, the absolute numbers, an important economic driver, the effect on the labor force, health services, housing, transportation, and I think that's what I was talking with Kay primarily about, was looking at transportation, public finance. And this is another factor for Littleton, is looking at that, and I'll show a graph on it, downward pressure on incomes and sales and property tax. Another big piece is that housing component, and looking at growth in households by age group. That 65 plus is this purple color, and that's going to be your fastest growing household type for the next two, basically almost 3 decades. And households at that 65 plus do act a little bit differently. So looking at, they might be downsizing, they might be what they call right sizing, looking at all of the deals with, I'm going to get the word, that basically, the housing unit has the right entrance, stair grades, sidewalks, door handles, that it works for a 65, but it also works for a 4-year-old. So looking at those kind of developments into the future, because what happens to that 65 plus? They continue to have birthdays. Eventually they'll sell their home and they'll move out, and that family that has a 2-year-old is going to want to live there. So making sure that there's that housing stock that is universal design. There we go. I knew it eventually would come. Make sure that those housing stocks fits all needs. So this is just what I was mentioning in terms of change in age for the state as a whole, but this is definitely hitting Littleton. From 90 to 2000, from 1990 to 2010, the share of your population 45 to 64 was growing as a share of your population. And tell me something about your 45 to 64-year-olds. Highest earning, highest spending on goods, highest spending property tax. From 2010 to 2030, fastest growing age group is going to be the 65 plus. Tell me something about the 65 plus. Lowest earning, because primarily they go into retirement. Lowest income, lowest spending on goods, lowest spending on property tax. So the impact that that's going to make in terms of the state finances, county finances, local finances can be significant. And I know like Aurora's done a study, for example, on that impact of the changing age on sales tax in their community.
So I followed most of what you said, but why would they pay less property tax if they stay in their same house?
Two different reasons, and this is looking at averages across all households. Eventually they downsize, and if the property tax credit, you take that into account.
Okay, I can see the tax credit, but if you downsize, somebody else moves into their house, so...
Right,
that
and I'm
whole
just
piece,
talking about ages
okay,
as a whole, but you're absolutely right if somebody takes that same housing unit. But if they downsize, and typically, anytime during that 65 plus, eventually they'll downsize. They won't be in the large home that they were in maybe when they were 35. So eventually, for that age group, tend to spend lower.
Yeah, Elizabeth, so has it been adjusted also as retirement age, for Social Security at least, increases the number to 67 or whatever?
Absolutely.
And also, older folks are now working longer and are healthier. Do these numbers reflect that?
Absolutely. Our forecast and our labor force forecast and our job forecast all takes into account that we're expecting people to stay in the labor force longer. And it would be awesome for the state if they do. Because that person that's still in the labor force makes a much bigger economic impact than when somebody retires. Not saying that retirees aren't awesome, because they are, but you get a bigger bang for your buck from a person that is active in the labor force. I'm not going to really talk more about this. I think just as we go forward, it's important to realize that we could see household incomes decline demographically, not economically, primarily based on age of the householder. And Colorado's always been in that top tier of household incomes, and we're going to see that slip, but not because anything's super negative about the state or about the community. It's just really our age distribution.
So another question, and you touched on this, so two pieces. So with the older folks, any way to know what kind of accumulated wealth they have, disposable income, disposable money,
Right.
not their property, and any other way to look at how much they might actually spend, because if they have accumulated money, they might spend more than they did while they were working. I know that sounds silly, but if they've planned well, saved well, and they've got retirement income or just savings that they can spend, So any...
That they might spend more at the 65
Yeah,
plus than the
because
under?
they've paid off their house, now that they don't have to
Then
pay
they have
their
money.
house off.
That's a good point. You know, it's really hard to get at that piece. A lot of people try to get at the wealth by looking at the house value, assuming that there's a relationship between their accumulated wealth and their current home.
And it's
But there's not a real good, you can only look at kind of averages, and knowing who's exactly in Littleton is tough. I wish. We get that question a lot. So just to tie things up and answer any questions, so some of the things that I think that we need to take into account for the state as a whole, because remember Littleton is part of the state, is that we have disparate growth throughout the state. There are winners and losers counties. There are winners and losers in terms of job growth and population growth. So it'll be important for us, I think, see as a state how we manage economic growth throughout the state. As I'd mentioned, we're going to be, one of the big impacts of aging is that we're going to have about 1 million people age out of the labor force in Colorado over the next now 16 years, just based on age and labor force participation rates. We do not have a disproportionate share of baby boomers. Every other state is going to be going through the same thing that we are. So we will be competing against Texas, California, Illinois, Florida for the best and the brightest. Do we have that competitive edge to maintain, that flow of information into the state and that the quality workers? We are going to see growth in high-end and low-end wages. That we've been losing ground on those mid-jobs, and also because of aging, we're seeing a growth at the high end and the low end. We've got the doctor and the home health aide. We've got eating out and lawyers or financial planners. So we've got a lot of growth at both ends, creating more bifurcation within the state. How do we manage that? And then aging is going to be fundamental. It's going to really turn us into a transition decade, that should say decades. And we'll continue to see this kind of downward pressure on household income based on age. Also looking at educational attainment, unfortunately we haven't been necessarily keeping up. And then long run and underemployment, looking at that group of youth primarily that are 20 to 30 that have been or underemployed, that we eventually want to be at that 45 highest spending age group. But if they don't make it through those kind of first tiered thresholds to become a productive worker, there's a lot of research showing that they will not be able to attain what their parents have attained. So the question is, who's going to buy my house 20 years from now, 15 years from now? Any questions? Did this help at all?
I have one question. Can you go back on an idea that you mentioned and just say it again and maybe amplify it a little bit? As the age 65, 66 folks continue to have birthdays, they will vacate jobs. The rate at which they vacate jobs compared to the rate at which people are coming in to assume the jobs, assuming the jobs don't change, because I know there's the information issues, the service issues, but if that was to remain, what will the impact of this be on an unemployment rate? And, and will that have some effect then on states' income?
So that whole concept of transition is exactly what we're talking about. So these previous concepts that we had in our mind about how society ran and how many jobs we needed to create each year to kind of create for the new folks coming into the labor force, our levers are going to be growing at a much faster rate between now and 2035 than they ever have. So we're going to be creating new job opportunities two ways, by levers and by new jobs. But the levers are going to be creating an even larger share of new job opportunities. So, yes, that should help to decrease unemployment. And this is the thing that I've been, if there's a silver lining of the recession, is that it gave us a little bit of breathing time, because if we had been continuing to grow as fast as we had, our labor force would be really tight right now. Then we've got all of these people exiting the labor force. We could run into labor shortages, and certainly in certain industries we've seen that. And we're competing for the best and the brightest. So what would that do to wage rates? What would that do to other pieces of the economy? But absolutely, when people are looking at economic development, I always kind of mention, like, be careful for what you ask for. Go for the best. Not necessarily the highest income, but go for the best job you can go for. Not any job, because pretty quick we could be short on workers.
And jobs that have staying power.
Absolutely. Staying power, and there's...
Next context, while you're talking, so you just...
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is through 2010, that comparison.
Most of the comparisons I showed was from 2000 to 2010, and then I did a forecast through 2040.
Right, with the forecast. But do you have any way to estimate the number of children born since 2010 in Littleton?
Not in Littleton. So the question, I don't know if everybody heard, how many babies would there be in Littleton? No.
Because we just came from an
But you know
event.
what? I think you can.
Well, we just came from an event, and I heard several people say, boy, look at all the children here.
I think,
And-
the thing is, I think CDPHE, Department of Health and Environment, releases births by place, because they do it by zip, and then I think they can aggregate that to place. So, yeah, we could go and look and see how many babies, but even between 2000 and 2010, that was the only age group that actually increased, was the under 5. You had declines in the 6 to 10 and the 10 to 15.
See, my block is kind of productive, so not me, but so, and I've done an awful lot of walking in the city, and I've seen lots of pregnant women in the last few years, and now babies. And
Yeah, so I mean, you could easily start to see a turnover starting to happen, for sure.
Thank you.
Couple questions. Just one example that I've heard previously is some of the industries, aerospace being an example, is on the cusp of having a bunch of leavers, people leaving that industry for retirement. But you mentioned educational attainment is lagging. The implication with that is that we're going to import people to work in those businesses. So, I mean, I guess if that's accurate, does that mean the state population growth is maybe potentially higher than what you're showing, or have you already factored that in? And does that phenomena tend to, I don't know, maybe mute some of these curves that show everybody aging? If you've got to import people for jobs that you don't have a local skill set for, whether they come from another part of the country or from India or China or wherever, what impact does that have to this thing? And I've got another question if you want to take a shot.
So it absolutely has an impact. Right now, our assumption is that we can fill jobs, not necessarily from Coloradoans, but somebody will come and fill that job. So we do a job forecast, and we have our population forecast by aging people through time. Where jobs grow faster than people, we have to migrate people in. As you saw, Colorado migrates in a lot of young people. So we're different than a lot of other states, to where we are still a relatively young state because we continue to migrate young people. Yes, if the U.S., if Colorado doesn't keep up on its educational attainment, somebody will fill that job. And or it could be more and more difficult to fill these jobs in the United States. Yes, they could easily be coming from other countries. But interestingly, other countries are also going through demographic changes. to where, for example, Mexico, not saying that, all jobs come from Mexico, or all people come from Mexico to fill jobs, but they're going through their own baby boom and baby bust to where they're actually needing workers to stay country of origin because they've got a lot fewer workers now. And so in terms of competing for the best and the brightest, even though world population is increasing, in a lot of places it's not. And we'll be competing for the best and the brightest.
Okay.
So yes, it behooves of us to educate our population. I mean, U.S. as a whole, but Colorado for sure.
Okay. And then I guess the second question is, a lot of data to interpret. There's a lot of complexity associated with all this data in terms of second order effects and all sorts of attributes that can, I mean, you're essentially showing a lot of average, more or less, data that could change if some input assumptions change, so forth and so on. So, but when you look at this across the state or other municipalities or other states, how do you link it to, or how do you guys take it to the next level in terms of assessing policy impacts that people have undertaken to try to address some of the trends you're presenting? In other words, if you've got all of the trends, the aging population kind of thing. So it's not something we haven't heard. It's not something we're not aware of. The challenge ends up being, okay, I'll buy it, but now what? I mean, the issue of what services are needed. How do you pay for those services? People that are 65 and older, for the most part, my understanding is, are going to be spending generally less on goods and services that would generate sales tax revenue. We're heavily dependent upon sales tax revenue to fund basic services, police, fire, roads, so forth and so on. So, I mean, how have other people tried to get to grips with that set of facts, or who has tried to sort of take what you've got and then provide policy options that can start to address this? Presumably they're a lot smarter than, for example, I am.
This is the one where Elizabeth claims out that she's a demographer and not a policy maker.
I'm not trying to get you to answer the question, but you've got to. The trend data is great, but the trend data is a tool to get you to something else. So how do you guys play a part in that process at the state level?
I will, defer to the mayor that we end up putting the data out there without any judgment on it so that people can make those decisions. I can give you some examples. For example, the rural resort region, so kind of the Summit, Eagle, Pitkin area. They've been dealing with this aging population for a long time. They realize that it's an asset to their community. They realize that they didn't have the services to retain their 65 plus, yet they knew that that was the largest share of wealth in their community. So they actively, policy, have started new programs to attract and retain their 65 plus.
So like what kind of programs?
Transportation, health services, a lot in the health services.
Okay.
Community services to help keep them there, because focus groups, figuring out what will keep you here in this community, how long will you stay, and a lot of it was really health service based and home health based and adaptive homes. So they've got so many stairs in the mountains, and a lot of people, if they've gone through a couple hips or knees, they're like done with stairs. So looking at what can they do to accommodate and keep people in the area. I don't know what Aurora did with their information on the study that they did in terms of, I think it was more just trying to understand how big that impact could be on spending. The beauty of the Denver metro area is the fact that the people that live in Littleton don't only spend in Littleton, and other people spend in Littleton as well. So beautiful and difficult, it's hard to say who supports your economy. It's not all
That's true.
Littletonites. Is
No,
that what
that's
you
true.
call? I don't know what they're called.
Little Tonians.
Little Tonys. So,
Just a couple of questions on some of this, Elizabeth, because we live in interesting times, and knowing some limitations of demographic projections, I just want to maybe review with you a couple of items that are key assumptions but may be different than or influence some of the projections that we need to pay some attention to and recognize we are doing the Boomer Bond survey later this year, so we'll have some idea as to what our population thinks of themselves anyway as we march further into the future. One is the assumption on the leavers, the folks that are in the workforce now that may be leaving. We're in Colorado, they tend to be healthier. Some of them aren't financially prepared for what comes after an income. And that whole behavior of the boomers, as leavers or not, may be a little bit different than what's there. And that's an assumption that leads to some of that on that side. Second is just a statement on my part, which is recognizing the bifurcation on income that we will be seeing. Colorado is not alone, and the United States is not alone. It's actually a global issue with regard to that bifurcation of income, and so that will be a big question that has influences and currents that are way beyond even what Colorado might have on some of those issues as we're taking a look at the future. Those are ones where trying to keep our finger on the pulse as to what goes on, it's going to continue to be interesting because what we're seeing is we're not alone in all of that.
absolutely. So maybe I'll just respond at least first to the leavers. Our assumptions are really actually fairly aggressive in keeping boomers in the labor force. We actually have doubled the labor force participation rate for the 65 to 69-year-olds. So it was as low as 6%. It moved up to 12% by, I think it was 2012, and we have it increasing to almost 20% by 2022. But it is amazing, absolutely, and I didn't bring this slide with me. It's amazing to see how labor force participation rates drop off, even starting as early as 55. A lot of folks, still work hardcore jobs in construction that the body just gives up by that time. But a lot more of us have had desk jobs and office jobs to where we will be able to stay in the labor force longer. And we are really hoping that they do. We're very aggressive on keeping that labor force participation rate fairly high out into the future for that age group. But regardless, all goes well, you'll continue to have a birthday, and most of us will be out of the labor force by the time we're 80. And so even taking that into account, we have a huge increase in leavers just because there's so many boomers and so few people over 65 right now.
Bifurcation on income.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a U.S. issue for sure. It's a global issue, and we have been declining in income equality since the 80s, and it's accelerating since the 2000s. I don't know. It was funny, I read an article the other day which stated that they didn't know if income inequality was actually bad, and that it gave incentive to those without to understand the difference. I'm not sure if I'm there, if I'm at that point. What I'm looking at is who controls majority of the income and wealth. And there's only so much a billionaire can spend in a day, but you give that billion to a larger share, they can spend a lot more of it in a day. Don't take this as I'm advocating any kind of redistribution of wealth, but economically, I think bifurcation can be a challenge. And then socially, I think it's a challenge for any community to deal with, because you have the have and the have-nots. And typically, it's led historically to civil unrest. And that's not an easy thing to deal with either.
Versus socialism, which doesn't lead to civil unrest. I mean, it all leads to civil unrest eventually.
And I'm not going to go any further. The question was on bifurcation and if it's happening globally, and yes.
So, and then just to kind of wrap this up, Council, this was not meant to be a decision-making piece as tonight. It's to add to our information and a richness of understanding as we proceed around the challenge that Councilmember Stallman talked about, is taking the data and then leading to policy that comes from a good understanding of the data.
Oh, and one of a follow-up piece is that all of the data that we've got here, it's based on census data. It is descriptive statistics. It comes from American Community Survey. We do use the economic information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well as the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Very little of it is just made up in my office.
Oh, yeah. No, I understand. Yeah.
And we vet all of our estimates and forecasts with communities every year. So we release it. We look for feedback. We release the assumptions. So we're always looking for active participation from local governments and communities for what those look like, if they seem unreasonable or too slow, too fast, whatever. So any feedback that you guys have on the information that I've presented is definitely welcome.
And when you figure employment, staying in the workforce, does that include part-time too?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So some of the retirees who are just doing some part-time work are in that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
They count as jobs, yes. Well, thank you very much. If there's any follow-up questions, please let me know, and I'll make sure that Mike has a copy of the presentation. That way, if you need it for anything, you've got it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. We need like a 10-minute.
Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, group.
Cool. I'll get my glasses.
Okay. Till 7:45.
Okay. So it's over. It's in Sheridan, yeah.
I'll find it. I'm going to try to go by there tomorrow.
Okay, council.
Okay, well,
Here you go. They got to, the website.
And we strive because we know not all the work is done. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Tracy Huggins. Tracy is the Executive Director of the Denver Urban Renewal Authority. She gets to also serve as a secretary to the board. I think that's the title that's there. Staff of 16 working on the project, some of whom we've had some Urban Renewal Authority developers in front of us earlier this year. Tracy and her husband live in Littleton, so she's excited to be working with us tonight. Her daughter, or at least one of her daughters, is 6'2" and is a starting basketball player for.
She wishes she was starting, but she does play.
Okay, and
She plays at the University of Colorado. She's in Buffalo.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
so with that, I think it was a couple of years ago, back in, well, it's 3 years ago, May of 2011, that Tracy was interviewed by 5280 and had a whole set of quotes that were there, so I'm just going to give you a couple of them. She said her most valuable lesson is to keep the eye on the prize, as I remember, being able to battle through the 24 no's before you get to that 26th answer of being yes. And the goal of urban renewal is to prime the pump for private investors in challenged areas and to help manage the risks that they're likely to encounter so that the successful private sector will be able to invest without public assistance. So with that, welcome Littletonite, Tracy.
Thank you. It is great to be here, and that was such an interesting presentation. And as the various slides were scrolling across the screen, you were describing me. I am the demographic that went through here. My husband and I moved. Well, first of all, we in-migrated from outside of Colorado. Both he and I grew up in western Montana, in Missoula, Montana. Yet we moved here from New York City. So we jumped over there, never imagined ourselves putting down roots there. Had an opportunity to come to Colorado, moved first to Denver. We lived in an apartment in Denver. And then when we got to a point when we wanted to have kids, we moved to Littleton, where we went very quickly from a household of 2 to a household of 5. We are now back to a household of 2, as the kids have all graduated from Littleton Public Schools. Very proud of the education that they have received here in Littleton. I brag about my youngest daughter because she's so tall and was able to, thankfully, get that athletic scholarship. Brag on my oldest as well, who, again, all of my kids they went to, where did we start? At Whitman, then to Euclid. Then they all graduated from Heritage. My oldest daughter graduated cum laude from School of Mines with an engineering degree. And so anytime I can plug the educational potential of kids going through Littleton Public Schools, I always take advantage of that. But we are that demographic, so I found that to be very interesting. I also think that the way that you have put together this evening is really terrific to look at what the future might hold for your city as you look at all of that demographic information. Thank you. And use that as an opportunity as you were looking at these significant areas of the city where you have the ability to influence the type of development that can occur, and how you may want to think about how development can either support what you saw and or change the outcome. Thinking about what are the things that she was talking about when you have the population that is going to ideally be aging in place those services. What might you also want to be thinking about in order to retain that place of having the person like me and my husband when we are no longer wanting to live in the micro unit in downtown Denver and instead want to start a family and have a home, and what are the goods and services that you want to be able to think about providing in order to shape what your city looks like, again, with these pretty significant development potential areas that you have. So I don't want to do much talking tonight. If my husband were here, he would chortle. Yeah, right. But truly, this is an exercise, as I'm understanding, to really engage the council and think about your role in working with the Urban Renewal Authority and again, thinking about what opportunities do you see presenting themselves, what challenges do you see, and how can you, with the Urban Renewal Authority, work through them. So what I want to do first, just as sort of a primer, is talk about how we certainly think about the built environment and defining the players and their roles. So it starts with the public sector. It starts with you. You are the group that is responsible for big picture visioning. You're not thinking necessarily about a specific development site, even necessarily a specific neighborhood. You're really charged with thinking about the city of Littleton. You are then the overseer of that vision. And that's part of what we're going to do tonight, is talk about that visioning. And once that's in place, you are the overseer of that. You are the minders of that, making sure that the market stays within those guardrails that you have put forward to try to advance that big picture visioning. Consequently, you have a very long-term view, looking at the outcomes, not just for today, not just for tomorrow, but truly for generations. So again, pretty weighty goal that you're being asked to deliver on. And you think about things like safety of your citizens, equity. How can we make sure that the citizens of Littleton all have the same opportunity to take advantages of parks, of open space, access to all of the goods and services that the city is looking to provide, as well as focus on predictability. You want development to happen in a way, as best you can, that implements that vision in a way that doesn't throw any one part of it out of kilter. And then you'll hear me use the term trunk infrastructure. Cities are traditionally responsible for infrastructure, but not all levels of infrastructure, particularly as development is changing over time. But when you think about the trunk infrastructure, those big regional, citywide improvements, whether they be roads or sewer lines or parks, that's, again, typically the purview of the municipality to put those forward. So that is at least part of the role of the public sector. Then we introduce the development community. They are the builders and the deliverers of that vision. They, unlike you that are looking at the entirety of the municipality, they are very site-specific. They're not looking to come in and develop everywhere in the city. They see specific sites where they believe that they have the greatest opportunity to undertake a development. They have a much shorter-term view. Developers typically, and I understand there may be a developer with us, come in, develop, sometimes hold, sometimes sell, sometimes hold for a long period of time, sometimes hold for 5-10 years, sell, make money, which is a good thing, to then go on and do the next development. So again, consequently, they have a much shorter term view as far as their involvement in a development. They are focused on profit, marketability of their product, as well as reputation. I would hope that you would see and appreciate that if a developer comes into your community and undertakes a project that you're not proud of, that doesn't have staying power, the likelihood of them being able to undertake successive developments is pretty compromised. So they value their reputation a great deal. And now we talk about Intract. The developers, certainly in Denver, the burden on the Intract infrastructure is put on the developer. So again, when you think about me, when I'm driving home at night, if I come down Broadway and then I turn onto Jameson, Broadway clearly is trunk. Jameson is pretty much trunk. When I then turn onto my street, which is South Greenwood Court, that is Intract infrastructure. That is that connector road that gets me from that main road to my home. And again, in Denver, that development responsibility is clearly placed on the developer. And then finally, we have the player who is the capital markets. They, from a viewpoint, have both a macro and a micro view. When they are looking to make an investment, they want to make sure that that is a product type that works more broadly in the area, but also that that specific development is going to be successful. So in many ways, they are the analyzer or the gatekeeper. So think about when any of us go to get a loan from the bank. They don't just say, sure. They want to understand what is that loan going to be used for? What is the likelihood of it being repaid, and is it going to work out? They have a more medium-term view, where you have the city as the very long-term view. The developer frequently will get financing for a project that will have a term longer than what they are even expecting to be in that project. And so their time horizon is sort of medium. And they, again, are focused on the marketability of the development because they care about the risk. They want to make sure that they are ultimately repaid. And at the end of the day, they are the money to make the deal work. So in a perfect world, all three of these things are working together. You have the public sector who has been able to put forward the vision, the developer that is able to execute upon that, and then the money necessary to allow it to work. But when you run into challenged areas, which is where urban renewal comes in, sometimes there just is not enough money to actually allow the project to move forward without some amount of public assistance. So that is then where the tool that is tax increment financing can come in and close that hole to be able to allow the project to move forward. I'm very intentional in making that circle as small as I can, yet still being able to write TIF in there and have it be visible, because I think that it's important, going back to our role of priming the pump, that we work to let the capital markets and the private sector work as hard as it can to deliver on the outcome. So consequently, when we are working on projects, we go through a very rigorous underwriting to make sure that the project is one that first and foremost is consistent with that vision. We should not be working on projects that aren't in furtherance of that public sector vision, and then making sure that the capital markets have been brought to bear in its full complement, and only that last piece should the public sector be responsible for delivering. That is certainly our viewpoint when we are looking to make an investment in a private development. That can be somewhat modified when you're talking about the investment in infrastructure, but this is really, again, about the more private sector development. Any questions or comments on that? Seem consistent with how you want to think about our respective roles? So then let's, as I'm seeing nodding of heads, let's focus then on that green circle, because that is the role of this group, and that really is I think the greatest opportunity that you have to be able to, with your urban renewal authority, think about what that big picture visioning is. Think about how you provide safety, equity, predictability in the delivery of that, and like I said earlier, lay that up against that demographic information that you were just provided, and how that may influence your thinking.
And Tracy, just to begin to get inside the green picture, a big part of our role is to find those things where we can coalesce inside a vision for the future, so that some of the elements of predictability are there, so that both the developer and the capital markets are extremely comfortable in Littleton.
Yes, because if there are things that the development community as well as the capital markets crave, it is that predictability. And so the more that there can be consensus around what that vision is, and that doesn't mean that everybody has to agree completely on everything, but the more clarity that you can provide in the vision, in the direction that you want development to go, the higher the likelihood of that, of the development community coming in and actually being able to deliver on that vision. All right, so with that, let me see if I can light back up. Now, of course, we were joking, how hard can it be? There we go, to get between this and the document camera, right?
Bingo.
Bingo. Phew. So just to kind of kick open the conversation, what, if anything, from the prior presentation gave you the most pause? Yes, sir.
I think she did a very good job of making you think in terms of waves of age groups and their demands, and that those waves are going to occur. There's a rhythm to them, and they have some predictability, and that given our current circumstance, if we were to have a vision of something being specific to any age demographic, we can be assured that within 10 to 15 years, we will be off the market, off the target.
So I'm hearing in that don't get too overwhelmed with the fact that the percentage of, again, I am so that demographic, the 51 to whatever, and, in a few more years, we're going to be rolling over to recognize that, but not necessarily build a vision specific to that, because otherwise you will have left behind all of the other age bands.
And what I was thinking just more specifically was with the, the silver tsunami kind of idea, putting in adaptability into something at the planning stage would be, I think that's the right word, adaptability. Bruce, we were talking about, so the stairs, the whatever it is, the universal, doing it early because you're going to need it later.
Push on that a little bit. Are you willing to pay for it? Should the developer pay for it? Why not? I mean, because those are sometimes the trade-offs when you are trying to bring a type of development in, that if it's not what the market would necessarily want to deliver, it may come with a premium that then is saying, if you really want this, we may need some public assistance. How would you think about where to draw that line?
Well, I'm going to draw the line and say if it's a 30-year project, it better have a significance to the population in 30 years, and that's the requirement.
You can certainly do regulatorily, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else in her presentation made you say gulp? And by the way, I will get to what in her presentation made you say, that's awesome. So what else made you a little anxious?
Well, I think that just the natural aging of the community and the fact that in that aging group, you have a diminished resource, financial resource for the community, and you also have an increased demand on services from the community. And that creates obviously a challenge, because it's like anything. If you take more withdrawals than you're making deposits, you have a problem. So I think one of the things that I was thinking about while she was doing it, because it's inevitable, I mean, as she's going through it, and you can look, I like how she always calls it birthdays, but you can look any city, anywhere, and there's not mass exoduses or mass influx. It's all gradual. So it's, as we see it's going to happen, and everybody knows, and we've been told it for years, I think that what kind of came to me was the opportunity ahead of that, the opportunity to work to create a community that would attract the other demo, that would be those that kind of, for lack of a better word, backfill, and as everybody moves through. And so to focus on that kind of opportunity there.
That was pretty good, because you turned a challenge into a positive. That's absolutely, I think, the right way to be thinking about it. One thing, and she's not here to correct me, so I'll be able to just recount what I have heard from another presentation, is not only the challenges that from a revenue source to the municipality or to the state that the aging population is creating, but you sort of have a double whammy, because the younger generation, they spend so differently than we do. They don't buy a car. They car share. They don't stay in a hotel. they Airbnb or whatever that is. And so even when it comes time then to buy a home, they are doing it much, much later. So it really is a double whammy when you think about the revenue streams that we all rely upon, in particular the sales tax. If the older generation, they don't want any more stuff. In fact, they're working to have less and less. And the younger generation isn't buying it either because they're either sharing it or they just don't feel they have the need. It presents a challenge for our respective economies.
Well, it's a challenge for any city that's built on sales tax, that, perhaps at some point there has to be a rethinking of that. And we've talked about the whole service taxes and stuff like that. But in terms of sales tax, we're already seeing problems with retail in that the internet is, so there's always something picking at that money there. So part of when I'm looking at these things, I'm thinking with the maps and stuff, I'm thinking that, stuff that isn't hard goods, but entertainment and activities and events and eating and drinking and those types of things or maybe a more sustainable resource or revenue source.
One last thought on that, and then I want to get Jerry's thoughts on the question of what gave you pause. Have you all undertaken a study to understand, on the sales tax again, where you are the net receiver of others outside the city and where areas it leaks out?
Very closely on that, Tracy. Unless you've spent money in Littleton to generate $18,000 per adult in your household of sales tax, push that up on what that level is, it came from outside.
In what areas? Is it primarily restaurants, entertainment, or are there other?
I don't recall off the top of my head. We've got it, but that's the average number. It's significant. We rely on visitors and coming through the community, but I don't know the answer.
Right. Well, I'm again, the fact that you are all looking at these different data points and working to bring them all together, I really commend you. Jerry, what made you say,
Well, it's the unknown, and I'm always skeptical when people can tell me they can predict the future anyway. Well, the one good thing I did see, though, is that Littleton doesn't have one dominating industry that would bring the city down to its knees, like a Detroit. The auto thing fell apart for them. So I see that as a good thing. But I do see our age as going up and down, as the world maybe is getting to an older group, but we'll adjust one way or another. I just don't know what that's going to be industry-wide. As Debbie just said, the retail sucks. But retail tax, has been the dominating revenue generator, and that is certainly changing on how people buy. I'm still haven't bought into the fact that younger people don't want cars. I have 20-something kids, and I was just recently in California asking the same question to another group of kids. They all eventually want a house. They all eventually want a car. Maybe if they're living downtown Denver, getting in a go-kart is cool, and I think that's a great little industry. It's a great niche to be into. But I think eventually they're all going to want a home where they don't have to share a wall or a ceiling or a floor. So I think Littleton, we have a lot of houses here. I forget what the number is, but it's about, 20,000 thereabouts. And they're going to need to be rehabbed, like many in Mr. Stallman in my neighborhood. Many of those folks have been rehabbed. Houses have been rehabbed, and there's certainly more to come. So I think there's going to be an industry out there for folks to do rehab.
I think you're right on virtually all of those points, and I want to focus for a moment on the younger generation, and I agree as well that there is, it's pretty interesting when you heard me talk about micro units, and are you familiar with that term? They're they're really small, and that may work for a while, but because I've had the same experience when talking to a group of kids, young adults, and asked that same question, how long do you see yourself continuing to live in this type of housing? The hands drop off very quickly after a very short number of years. And so the expectation is then that they will be looking for something that is more akin to what their parents had. It may just be later. And so, again, one of the other comments that she made is, you're entering the market later. Do you ever really catch up to do that full backfill? Who have I not asked? See, I'm tall, but I cheat with high heels, and that allows me to look over.
The phrase one of the phrases she threw up on the board that she sort of started talking about it further, but I think it's more complex. It was transition decade. So there's a handful of concepts in there. The first is transition from something to something. So certainly the aging demographic was, I think, the focus of what she was more or less getting across, but there's probably more in there than that. The decade piece of it is interesting because it sort of says there's a timeline involved, and I think maybe it was Debbie that sort of said, we've got to put something in place today that benefits the short, medium, and long term, and that's not easy. But I guess if you go back, maybe turn it around the other direction, whatever the transition from something to something is, we will still be expected as a city to provide certain things. So police, fire, medic, roads, sanitation, open space, library and museum maybe. I mean, those are, I guess if you want to call them, for the lack of a better phrase, core city services. And people have an expectation of some level of quality. And I think there's always an ongoing intent to figure out how to do more with a finite amount of resources. But if those resources start going backwards, by virtue of the demographic attributes that Bruce Beckman was talking about, the challenge needs to be to figure out how to put something in place that sort of mitigates all of that economic trending as things transition, with a finite timeline and still sort of keep the character of the community intact.
But let's pick up that thread even before we start looking at these areas. What are some of those things? What are some of those things that help you not slide back so that you're no longer the desirable community, therefore you no longer have the revenues, therefore it exacerbates the problem of being able to provide for that safety, equity, and you're now stuck in that downward spiral? What are some of those things that you think Littleton should seek to maintain, whether it's the rehab of the housing stock that is there or add to the overall mix to try to mitigate the risk of going into that downward spiral?
Well, you want me to keep rolling here?
You get the chance. She's looking at you.
Please.
Remember, I'm going to be equal opportunity, so.
Yeah, no, exactly. I throw a couple things out. We've got terrific assets, which we know about. All right, so open space, trails, recreation facilities are almost, without peer. The school system is extraordinary. And those are huge because they support property values, which support some level of wealth accumulation, which then does somehow flow back into the community. I don't know what the demographic impact of that is. Are people going to, as we age, the school system isn't our issue directly, but it is indirectly because we cover the same stakeholders, the citizens. So, their success ends up being our success and vice versa. And ultimately, it has to manifest itself in some sort of economic, commercial leg of the stool, which I think we've done collectively as a community. I think we've done a credible job coming out of the recession in that. But then again, what are the next steps and what should those look like, and who, what, when, where, why, and how?
I don't know your name.
Peggy.
Peggy.
So it seems to me an implication of what she said is, and she didn't say it, is to capitalize on our seniors, on our aging population, and try to attract more who have, I'll call it disposable income, but it's the money. People who have planned well, who have some retirement and want to enjoy the next 30 years of their lives if they retire at age 60 and live to be forever. There are a considerable number of seniors that bike, that walk. I mean, we see them around. And we have a very bikeable, walkable community, not just on the trails, but on the streets and so forth. We have an incredible medical resource area that people want to be near and use the services of, even if they prefer not to use. I mean, wish they didn't always have to, but that's a huge resource too. And it attracts people also who can assist people occasionally at home, not necessarily all the time, but occasionally. There are people who want to stay in their home who might benefit by having a live-in companion, someone younger who is not married or divorced or whatever, but who has that. So I think all of that's a huge opportunity. If people can, well, I didn't mention something else, the tremendous restaurants that we are establishing, that have been established, then people want to go out to eat, and they range in prices, they range in types. So all of that. I think the immigrant community is a tremendous asset. And we haven't at all dealt with really trying to, I think, assess what they would like that they might be spending money on. Stores that cater to them that other people like to go to too. But we don't have them. There's not too much of that in the whole Denver area, except in certain
Pockets, right.
little pockets. So I see the challenges, in a sense, to be the very thing that is something to exploit's the wrong word, but to build on.
And my friends call me Randy. You're welcome to be one of them. So I see it as the distinction between the challenge versus the opportunity. And I think we've been treated to perhaps a bit of a sobering representation in the demographics of how we have an aging population, and those are the challenges. But we have an opportunity from call it the redevelopment perspective or the retrofitting perspective of a city. That this is a town in which most of the housing stock was built in the 40s and 50s. And like all things, it's worn out, not everybody's house, but sort of generally speaking. And I think there's a sort of an opportunity to capitalize on the school system that Bruce referenced, the Greenway system that he referenced, and that Debbie's really been working on for the last few years, and to reorient and reprioritize some of what we previously thought. When you drive down Santa Fe, you'll see a lot of windows facing the highway and brick walls facing the Greenway, which in today's world is madness. But that's how it's built. So I think, and we do have some extraordinary vacant parcels, and that's the opportunity that I'm talking about. I also see this aging of our population, perhaps more so than most, but it's, we're in pretty good company, I think, as having an opportunity to really look hard at doing really interesting and really forward-looking developments, patio homes, denser properties, maybe not the micro units that we were referencing, but I'm talking about opportunities for our seniors who are living in these 950 square foot bungalows with the carport, and maybe they can't mow the lawn, or maybe they don't want to mow the lawn anymore. Surrendering that housing stock to a younger population. So, talk about the great circle of life. We're in the middle of it, and I think we have the opportunity, both from a development perspective and from a public policy perspective, to encourage that renewal and rebirth, if you will.
Let's talk about some of these areas with those things in mind. Where would you like to start? We could be very systematic here. I'm a CPA, so I have a tendency to go one at the top. Or we can.
You got to get by the mic.
I'm sorry.
You need to get by the mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So let's start with number 4 at the most north. Really throw myself off instead of going numerically. Opportunities that this site presents, challenges that this site presents. We'll be more optimistic and start with opportunities. So this is the area, I'll find as we are looking at this. So this is the area that is generally bounded by, if I'm reading this right, Bellevue on the north, Lowell on the west, just north of Westbury Avenue on the south, and Prince Street, if it dropped straight down, on the east. So for my benefit, describe why this is on the list, which again goes to the challenges as well as the opportunities. Yes, sir.
This was an area that in times past was dominated by the Centennial Racetrack. And so when the Centennial Racetrack was in that area, all the homes that are to the left that we're talking about all have the names of racetracks on their streets are all named that way. And where the golf course is, and it was pretty much where the racetrack was. And in the development of the time, the north part became commercial. So what we have today is, I think, an area in which the golf course makes a tremendous impression. But when you get up into the commercial areas, they're dated and they're no longer really fully productive. The housing is still in the racetrack area, and is a very popular place for people to live. It's a place where people come and do redo houses and really redo them. So I feel as though we're really focusing on the commercial up in there. And one other part of it is across the street's Englewood. And I think it's important that it be Littleton. That what we're talking about reflects Littleton, and it has some sense of Littleton in it.
So is it, I'm struggling a little bit. Thank you for the explanation. Trying to understand why the western boundary goes, sorry, stay back over here, why the western boundary goes as far as it does as opposed to being drawn in to only capture the commercial.
Because Bellevue is commercial up to Lowell, with a few housing exceptions. And where it is housing, it's not quite as strong housing as further back in the neighborhoods.
You have that section that's not only there along Bellevue, but at the intersection of Bellevue and Lowell, on that, which is the northeast corner, is also commercial, and so that's primarily why the inclusion.
Northeast or southeast?
Excuse me, the northwest corner northwest corner. not
Of the
northeast.
parcel,
Of the
of the
parcel.
southeast corner of the intersection.
Right. Southeast corner of the
Are
intersection.
you looking at the larger scale version, not that? So, yeah, that little triangle in the corner is all commercial.
Okay. So think for a moment then about some of the things that you have just put forward as far as taking, Littleton as a whole. Now we're going to come down to these smaller areas. You've talked about I think I'm hearing a desire to reinvigorate the retail that exists there currently. Is that correct?
I think that would be priority number one. My opinion.
There, now that's. Yep. So I'm hearing one vote for reinvigorating the retail. Other thoughts? Peggy.
If we don't get the Marketplace Fairness Act sorted out, I don't see personally any real good payback on reinvigorating any retail, because people are going to keep shopping online and avoiding the sales tax. It's a sad reality, but the competition from the online sales is the prices you can get just undercut everything. So I'm very anxious about that.
So I'm hearing caution when it comes to reinvigorating the retail, lest we put too much emphasis on that because of the other competing forces. Yes, sir.
There's what's around that particular area, the parcels in the center, with the exception probably of O'Toole's greenhouse. I'm not sure where exactly. I guess it's sort of in the.
It's almost just.
Yeah.
Straight down.
Straight. Yeah.
Slightly right there. That's it. Slightly above.
Okay.
center.
Okay. So the I think the property to the north was what the old charter was, the charter school. And,
Yes.
And then the property to the south is the election center, which used to be some sort of shopping center or something. I mean, when you look at the number of houses, and then to the east you've got a very large number of apartments / condos, it seems like, again, maybe to what Debbie was talking about a little bit with the demographic shifting, maybe what needs to be in that area more so than straight retail is entertainments and restaurants. And that might pull more in from Englewood and Denver and Sheridan, a little bit to the north, because they're really, I don't know how, I haven't taken a census, but, no pun intended, but I'm not sure what you have to either go to, I guess, downtown Main Street to go get much in the way of restaurants, or you'd have to probably go to Aspen Grove. If you go to the west, that's pretty much Bomar, and you have to go out to Southwest Plaza. And if you go north on Federal, you're sort of in Sheridan, and maybe I guess you go up to River Point. So, I mean, I don't know what the market factors would be that would drive somebody to develop that, but just looking at that aspect of it with the residential attributes around it and the recreational kind of stuff with the golf course and the river's not too far away, maybe some sort of restaurant / entertainment kind of facility would be interesting.
But one of the challenges of the area, not unlike what you were just saying, is that it is a somewhat isolated area. It's difficult for any business over there to survive. Home Depot, of course, has the Santa Fe available to it. But as far as the other folks living over there where the names of the streets are all racetrack type stuff, it just isn't enough to support the small businesses that are right there at Lowell and even right there at O'Toole's. It's a very difficult area to generate enough money coming in.
I see that location as being in the intercept position to catch all the traffic from, for example, Bomar and indirectly, admittedly, Columbine to Santa Fe. And the old adage is, there's not enough maybe housetops to support the commercial. I'm not sure I agree with that, but pretending that I do, then you make it a mixed-use development so that the housetops are on the same side as the commercial and it's self-supporting. So I would see that as a more of a if I were going to draw that up in a half an hour, I would draw that up as a mixed-use project.
Just one comment, there's a huge amount of driveways and parking there far beyond what's covered by buildings. It's just,
Clearly underutilized, right?
yeah, it's a lot of parking space.
Parenthetically, I'm sorry for interrupting if I did anybody. This is a property, the northernmost property has been owned by a developer for a while. Someone should tell me, at least 2 years, who has, I believe, at least several times submitted and then pulled their application for doing a strict residential apartment project, a large one. And perhaps they read the tea leaves, perhaps they couldn't get their financing, perhaps, but in any event, it's not pending right now. So we don't necessarily have the opportunity to dictate what's going to happen. All that we know is what the developers thought was going to happen has not to date.
And if this were to be 100% residential, which I sort of am asking a leading question because I didn't hear anybody offer that would be an appropriate land use for this site, what would your reaction be and why? If instead of mixed use, just continuing the pattern that you are seeing coming from the west, from the south, and then even over on the Englewood side?
Well, it seems like it would be underutilized given other 100% residential for that entire central area. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know, the lack of the avoidance or the opportunity cost of missed potential commercial opportunities or sales tax revenues from commercial would seem to me to be not desirable. I think the whole mixed use thing has some possibility, but because in theory, if the reason commercial or whatever hasn't, retail or restaurant or anything else hasn't gone in there is lack of households theoretically or rooftops. Okay, fine, I could mentally see where somebody would want to have some amount of residential, but quid pro quo, incremental residential, if it's generating incremental sales tax, given again the prior presentations.
And I would add from a tax increment standpoint that not only are you limiting your sales tax potential, but you've also then depressed your property tax as well under the Gallagher Amendment, with residential being assessed at a lesser rate. So, and that's really what I was looking to see, how you're thinking about not just what it is, but then the yield back to the city, because and not only that, so you get potentially less revenue, but then also demand for services. So thinking about that mix, I think is again part of the exercises as you were looking at all of this.
And Tracy, just to look at it on an unconstrained level, yes, there's a segment, a fairly substantial segment of that properties that are in there that's owned by the county at this point in time, which is not providing revenue. The location of the storage of voter machines is not necessarily unique to that particular space, so that if you widen the consideration to not just be the northernmost property, but possibly to be largest, that little odd-shaped white top that's right there in the middle of the box, that is the nation's largest destination travel organization, and it happens to be headquartered here in Littleton. And so to just move all of that to residential would be inconsistent to some of the character that already exists there.
So, look, yes, ma'am.
So I'm looking at the whole area map, and it strikes me that section is maybe the most difficult one to tackle. That if we do some exciting things, some good things, some beneficial things, whatever, that changes some perceptions of Littleton, that then ultimately would be ripe for doing something else. But it seems to me, though, that one ought to be on a back burner for a while for some of the same reasons that people have been saying. So these other...
So the others you think have more
Yeah,
immediate catalytic
Yeah, that
potential?
then can become catalytic for that.
So let's go with that for a moment, and if you were to rank your top 3 of these 6 from the most catalytic opportunity, what would they be?
I'd go with 5.
I hear 1 vote for 5. I need to find my main sheet here. I have 1 vote for 5.
Mike, you want to put the main map back up? Thanks.
Tracy, when you say catalytic, to make sure we're all on the same page, what do you mean by catalytic?
What do you mean by catalytic?
That's a facilitator.
Yes.
I would say number 2. I think number 2, that's the answer area, right?
Yeah,
Correct.
That's Littleton's game changer.
yeah, I agree.
That's what I see as catalytic meaning. It's the
And-
biggest effect that we can have on the city, those 110 acres.
It's not just 110, it's the other 20 she's got on the north side too, at least in that. So it's 130 or so acres, and I agree with Deb. That's probably the biggest because for the most part, there's nothing there. Anything.
110.
But apart from that,
110.
you get tremendous exposure of people going past on Santa Fe, on Mineral, and even the people who are coming through the light rail station. So it's tremendous exposure.
Yes.
2 is interesting by virtue of the fact that the majority of it is brownfield. So you could come up with something in fairly short, notwithstanding it doesn't have a lot of those other issues like drainage and so forth and so on. I just think they can make a compelling argument for number 3 by virtue of the fact that there's already a lot of traffic in that area. It's probably the oldest and potentially the most opportunity for redevelopment as a gateway. And in fact, the redevelopment's already occurring with things like the King Soopers building as well as the CarMax that went in. Certainly, Wells Fargo's interested in exiting that building, so forth and so on. It wouldn't be easy, but there's a lot of upside.
And tie that into the number 5 and tie that into the downtown.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential. And as number 2, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So am I hearing, because really different parts of the city, very different from a build-out standpoint where one has a great deal of development potential and the other is much more already built out but is older, and that catalytic means potentially 2 different things. One, I want to hear more when you say the game changer, what is the game that we are changing to, as well as looking at 3 and 5 to put the brakes on from a sliding back standpoint. That this is would you characterize 3 and 5 as some of the most, if you'll allow me to use the term, at-risk areas? Vulnerable, thank you, that's a better term, that if we don't do something in these areas, all of a sudden if you're not already on the slippery slope, you're well on your way? Is that
They
a
have a
fair
lot of
representation of the two, sort of the two distinctions of these two very different areas? So, Debbie, back to game changer. Close your eyes and you see 10 years from now, this area being not what it is now, but instead, what is that game changer?
I think it's a regional attraction. I think that there's a great deal of development further south. Highlands Ranch is nearly built out, but there's a great deal of development going on in Douglas County. There's the Aspen Grove Shopping Center draws an incredible amount of shoppers. I would actually probably say they have more shoppers outside of the Littleton zip code that come from the mountains, the Jefferson County up into Morrison, and so we get quite a draw because we're kind of like the first stop.
The intercept, right.
I think that it's obviously growing more and more important to urban dwellers to have the outdoor opportunity, and we have an incredible property there with the river and some protected area that it's harder and harder to find those properties. We also have the light rail and the transit-oriented development, which we've never done over there, and that would all be part of that. And so it would be a place where the housing opportunities are pretty endless. It is a place where there's an opportunity for new, different, exciting retail. There's a possibility for entertainment. There's a possibility to put in a sports arena. There's a possibility to put in a massive theater arts complex. There's a possibility to put in, the Mall of America. That's not but you know what I mean. Something what that was in the 80s. Then what's the next big thing? I don't know what that is, but we have 110 acres that in the south that's within a municipality on good cross streets with a light rail. Because I can tell you right now that light rail is stopping there for the next 20 years. That line is not moving further down for at least, we'd be lucky if it was 15 years. So we have to plan for that. And then when it does move down, goody. More benefit anyway.
Right. Did I hear someone say this was brownfield property?
There's nothing there now.
So-
There's a
But is it-
zoning, there's a zoning map on it.
Are there environmental challenges?
Yes,
It's a floodplain.
massive drainage problems.
Contamination? Soil
No,
contamination?
no.
So not brownfield
No.
in that,
Not hazmat.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's been pasture and,
But you have infrastructure challenges? Okay.
yeah, because see across the street, that lake over there and that earthen dam,
Who owns it?
Inglewood. Inglewood owns the lake. Who owns that property?
Yeah.
One family, Inser family. But then, the part of it that is where we have to go, I think, and where encouraging a developer to go, and we had the Urban Land Institute in here a couple weeks ago talking about, they looked at the RTD station there, the mineral station in Aspen Grove, and what could be done better, different, regarding parking and more accessible shopping and more living area. And so that is the small part of that, that's the tip of it, but it also is a huge component of it, because that's where the light rail is, and that's where there's existing development. So how do you, somehow or another, those two things are going to have to marry together, and that right now they're both completely opposite.
Well, and just from the writer of the light rail, you're standing room only after that stop early in the morning, so you know that there are people coming in from everywhere, and so not only are you the front of the line, you're the end of the line as well, and I think that presents some pretty interesting opportunities as the person who now is getting off of the train, and I'm here, what do I need to be able to, or what do I need to grab before I go home, and you know, that isn't necessarily being offered at Aspen Grove. But you're right, from an infill standpoint, there's huge opportunity. How have you been thinking about the balancing of looking at taking advantage of potentially new infill opportunities while not forsaking the older parts of the cities? You know, going back to numbers 3 and 5.
Say that again. What was the question?
How are you thinking about balancing resource, the deploying of resources for areas like number 2, where it is, you know, the game changer, as opposed to continuing to make investment in the existing parts of the city that need it for whatever those reasons may be? Again, sections 3 and 5, I think, were
All of the above.
Go ahead.
Can you do it all?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
This doesn't quite answer your question, but part of the challenge of this is 3 and 5 need to retain a sense of being Littleton, the sense of place of Littleton. You can't go too far afield from that sense, whatever that sense is. And I'm not saying to still be 1950s or 60s or 70s Littleton, which we'd be replacing, but just the idea it's still kind of part of this place, sense of place called Littleton. That's a bigger challenge than 2, where you can go a little bit more away from that restriction, or that, you know, maybe it's an opportunity too. So in answer to your question about putting resources and that kind of thing, the big bang for the buck is 2. You know, that's the biggest, most significant change, retail, all those things we're talking about. But when you talk about the idea of urban renewal, renewing a part of Littleton that is on the spiral down, 3 and 5 is where we should be putting our money, because if that's the goal. The other is great, but 3 and 5 is where we can continue to have the kind of Littleton that people want to have, and not lose it completely. I mean, I think it's so in need of rejuvenation and still keeping it Littleton.
What's happening in 3 and 5?
I think you have, change just from lack of planning and things that occur over a period of time. You know, nobody ever knew how it would end up. Here we are today with it. But I think you have some unmotivated property owners that see no reason to take the risk of developing anything. And you have a few very successful little businesses that it's really important that we protect them. So
I need to find 5. What is the makeup of the residential stock? Is it owner occupied? Is it
A lot of rentals.
rental?
It's a lot of rentals. It's sort of a northeast neighborhood in a general sense. Once, you know, on the north side of Littleton Boulevard is got a fair amount of rental units. That diagonal road over there most of those are all apartments. A lot of them are South Metro Housing Options owned. The empty space to the north is the Norgren parking lot. So that's an industrial property. The housing stock was probably built in the 50s. A lot of them, they're smaller homes. A lot of them, people have moved and they're now rental units.
But you don't have to go far though in District 5 until you start getting into
Correct.
nice homes.
No, that's correct.
It's really,
Yeah.
it's really 3 that is most of the rental section, and maybe far right part of 5 would be the rental. After that, yes, nice
Yeah.
homes, they seem to be able to.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly the opportunity to do some level of renovation. It's not like the property values are degraded beyond repair.
It's prime, man, I think it's prime.
Yeah, it's great location.
Randall, then Debbie,
Well,
then Peggy.
I talked before about the challenge versus opportunity, and I'm going to recycle that concept for a second. I think that we have certainly a challenge in what we've numbered here. It's 3 and 5. I mean, and there's a crossover. It's not just all one or all the other, but more so, I believe, in opportunity in 2. And to an extent, 1, and I'll get to that in a second. I'm not just sort of trying to fill in the whole map, but I think we have an obligation, and I feel an obligation to help, and Jerry picked a very good word, those neighborhoods are vulnerable, and I think we need to support them and to try to rejuvenate them and to retrofit them, and we talked about that before. But I think that perhaps is going to be a challenging endeavor and one that's going to be expensive and one that we might be able to more easily accomplish with greater effect through perhaps the tax revenues that we will be able to bring into, for example. And to me, the big tiebreaker in all this, and this is a well-worn tale, but I mean, there are municipalities all over the metro area that are dueling, killing themselves over the light rail station. They want one here, they want one there. Everybody wants a light rail station. Well, we have 2 of them, and we've done nothing with them at all. We've had no discernible development spring up in, around, or near either of our light rail stations because they're light rail stations. And this, throwaway word, whether it's TODs or whatever you want to call it, we have none of it. And it is incredible, I believe, to the other municipalities in town who are, as I said, are desperate to get a light rail station so they can start reaping the rewards. And here we have, as Debbie mentioned, 110 acres around 2. To an extent, we also have 1, which is very proximate to our other light rail station. So, to me, I'm not saying 1's more important. Maybe the 3 and 5 is more important, but maybe we pay for 3 and 5 through some of the things that we're able to succeed in it's always easier to build new than to retrofit, and maybe that's the shortest distance between 2 points.
As an observer, I find it interesting that you say that not much has happened around the light rail stations.
I would say nothing is happening around the light rail stations.
That you've directed or that the market has done? Because I see an awful lot of residential development proximate to the stations.
To our stations?
Now, at the mineral stop, you're constrained because, well, even the residential that's happened closer to the river after Aspen Grove has come in. But, so, again, just a potentially a different observation.
Okay.
I do think that that the term TOD still is amorphous enough to everybody that they don't really, it sounds great, but they don't really know what it is, and therefore if you don't know what it is, you don't know exactly what it means and then how you deliver upon it. But I think that increasingly people and municipalities and others are seeing the development potential that the transit should be creating. Now, whether it is, and whether it is or isn't, with or without any type of public investment, I think is still, kind of figuring itself out.
Fair enough.
Tracy, if I asked you to put on your hat, other than as a facilitator, at least my thinking is with 2, I'm going to add into that is it's probably easier to get something moving if we can help it nudge along, because we're dealing with a couple of property owners, one being RTD, possibly one being Aspen Grove, and their ownership, and the other being Enzor, that there's a very limited ownership across the properties and being able to aggregate together a plan for something might be at least my sense is, would be easier. The challenges that exist in 3 and 5 is multiple property owners, and it's going to take a longer time frame. And so when I said all of the above, they both of those need to be done. And I would add, adding to Randy's comment on 1, and he can jump in at any point in time on 1. 1 is an interesting characteristic because it can be catalytic for other activities because it's very proximate to our existing downtown. It is pinned between our downtown and the river presence, and it is very much one of those things that we need to have carry forward a Littleton identity because it is close to at least our commercial downtown core on that. And at least at this point in time, there might be fewer property owners than there might be on 3 and 5 in looking at that. And whether that can come together or not, I don't know. But those are some of my thoughts, and Randy, you can jump in at any point in time in thinking through that.
So putting on the Urban Renewal Authority hat, you're really dealing with 2 very different circumstances, obviously, right? You have the infill opportunity, which is a precious commodity. As our cities are, pretty finite as far as where we have the development opportunity, when you have these large parcels of land where you can address the potential that they provide to you, that's a pretty interesting and exciting opportunity laid up against then what already is there. And from an urban renewal standpoint, that's really where we started, was taking those areas that were challenged and doing more spot blight, if you will, remediation to try to lift an existing area up. What is it in these areas that is causing it to be different? And if you can identify that and remedy that in the most specific way to then let the market lift itself up, then that can be success. And that's hard when you go into a community that it didn't get this way overnight, and it's not going to turn itself around overnight either. And when you start making investment and things start to change, then you have to be ready and willing to have some of the other harder conversations, like now it's gentrifying. Now it no longer is affordable where it used to be before. And thinking about all of those things that come along with reinvestment in an area to help stop that downward spiral, and how do you work and should you work? I mean, that's a whole nother area of debate. How much should the public sector be influencing normal market outcomes? And again, going back to that green circle, as I have it up, but you do not, you are responsible for making sure that there is a level of equity across the city. So it's not appropriate to turn a blind eye to those other areas only because you see the opportunity that presents itself. And I love the comment that was made that if you have the discipline, and now I really am talking to the city council as far as if you have the discipline to recognize that there are additional resources, to deploy those resources where they aren't going to be otherwise generated, I think can be a real appropriate solution. But you have to be disciplined in doing that because, as you know, there's always calls on the city's budget, and how do you make sure that that latest call doesn't take away from that going in objective of, if we get these additional revenues, our intention is to deploy them here. They are very different, very, very different exercises, but it can work. So I don't know how late we intend to go. This is fun for me, so I'll
I don't have an appointment till 10 tomorrow morning.
Mine might be a little bit, but if I can use that as a moment just to kind of show you some of the different things that we've done and sort of how we think about urban renewal in that regard, would that be okay?
Could we get a couple more ideas?
Absolutely. Plus it'll take me a moment to figure it out as well.
Because one of my concerns is what happens to the rest of Littleton if we don't do certain things, because we can have gradual decline. And Debbie mentioned on the Enzer property, for example, about a stadium. She and I had not talked, but that was one of my thoughts too. Not just a stadium, maybe a stadium that faces east, maybe on the backside, something that faces west so you get the tremendous mountain views, whether it would be a hotel or upscale apartments or what, with a huge public outdoor area where maybe including a sculpture garden that would draw people who are going up and down the South Platte on their bikes or whatever, people coming from the west, people coming from the east. And I'd love to see something that Denver did when they came and presented to us. They pointed out they invested in an iconic bridge that then, in a sense, helped spearhead a different perception of that area down where near down there. I'd love to see an iconic bridge over pedestrian, bicycle, whatever bridge over mineral, connecting pieces. So if you really energize this one place, get people to come to a stadium for games and park area, whatever, they can also then go over the bridge to Aspen Grove, helping refuel that. And it would be nice to have more revenue so we could invest more in a really significant way in some other parts of the city. Otherwise, we're probably going to do these little, I won't use the word that comes to my mind, these kind of lowball things to rehab and rejuvenate, when it would be nice to have some real eye-popping things in the 3 and 5 that are on the map, and elsewhere too.
Tracy, to keep us focused, just environmental, shoot for 9:30 with a total turnoff at 9:40.
Okay, we can do that. Yes,
I
Debbie.
just wanted to add on to that. You know, when you look at the different parcels, when you look at 2 and then you look at 3 and 5, you're really looking at a clean slate versus an established neighborhood, like a 100-plus-year-old neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think that the best thing that the city can do in this, in certain circumstances, and 3 and 5 might be some of that, is to encourage and make easy and make available opportunities for that community for things to change over there. The King Soopers is an example of that. We did not ask King Soopers to build an entire new store, but they came in and said that they wanted to, and would we participate in a tax share. Is it a share back, Michael?
Correct.
And so I think extending that open arm and welcoming that sends a message. And it's not an urban renewal, but it is an opportunity for the city to say, we want this in this neighborhood. We want this to happen. The same thing with across the street on Broadway, the car dealerships and the CarMax and these that are, and they're making improvements and they're doing that on their own, and we're doing it with full support. Part of it is making, Littleton Boulevard and working with these guys, and we've got a grant program. I mean, maybe it's bumping some of this stuff up, maybe putting it on a little bit more, on more steroids than it is right now. But I think that in many ways, the best way to transition these neighborhoods is it's kind of like a lake turns itself over. If you go in and turn the lake over, you're going to kill it. So, but how do we guide, how be involved, support, and also listen to the community about what do they want. So I think that in some ways, it's a lot more a delicate operation than a brownfield, but it is also a place where our attention can't be diverted, where we have to stay very attuned and very engaged in what those property owners are doing and what they're interested in. One of the things, when we did a visioning last year, I think it was, and we talked about that area, and we talked about one of the special features of that area is the diversity, because we don't have that diversity in the other three quadrants. So it is, in fact, building upon that diversity. So I think, while they're both really important, and every one of these is, because it's all part of our city, it's different. You have to apply different types of pressure to each one, different types of attention.
I could not agree more. I keep meaning to ask, does Littleton have a single-family rehab program?
Only through the housing authority for income, with the income limits.
Okay. But so they deal with single-family residents outside of their program?
Correct.
Okay. Good, because we could talk about that too. That's one of the things that Dura does with Denver. Resources from the federal government are getting more and more scarce, but that has been a huge program for Denver. We've been their contractor for goodness over 40 years now. Again, there's income restrictions, but working really to maintain the housing stock has been, of great importance to Denver as well. So, want to just talk for a couple of minutes. I'll watch the clock here, but how we can define the public benefits of urban renewal. And as I go through this slide, it's going to appear as if it's one of these three, but frequently the outcomes of a project can do a number of these things. So when we provide financing to close that financial gap, we can either address a complete market failure, and I'll show an example of each of these. We can act as a market catalyst, or we can enhance a market outcome. I think those are really the three things that we seek to do. When I'm walking through this, try to imagine those different areas on the map. I think the one that is, well, I'll just leave it like that. So what do I mean address a market failure? So just make it happen, period. The reason I was asking, when you talk about a brownfield, to me that generally intones environmental contamination. In some of the infill areas that we're working on right now, that is just such a barrier to redevelopment that absent some type of public assistance to just address the environmental challenges, development isn't going to happen. And the other thing, so again, now think about wherever our number was down here, lack of infrastructure. Again, depending on what the expectation is of the developer to provide that infrastructure, if it overwhelms the development plan, clearly the public sector needs to step in. We can act as a market catalyst, and by that we mean make it happen sooner. And we want to be careful in this because from time to time urban renewal is accused of picking winners. Oh gosh, because we're going to deal with you, you now have an opportunity. That's not really what we are talking about here. We're talking about reducing the risk of pioneering. So go back to your example of the Millennium Bridge in Lodo in the Central Platte Valley. Even though that is one of the hottest real estate markets in the metro area right now, that wasn't always the case. It was a very, very, very challenging place to be. And so those first developers that were seeking to undertake activity there, had to address very serious pioneering risk. And so the public sector can work to mitigate some of that. It signals to the development community the political importance, which again is what you are doing tonight. You are putting up there for all to see these areas of the city where you think investment can and should be directed. So that can frequently then be implemented through the Urban Renewal Authority. You can also bring forward neighborhood amenities, and we'll talk about that as well. Or you can enhance a market outcome. You can take a development and make it better. To the extent that there is a desire for additional affordable housing and the developer wouldn't otherwise do it. You can help bring that that project cost into a place where they can provide more of that. I deal with the costs associated with this historic preservation, provide some of those placemaking amenities that I think you're referring to as well. So we are creating the revenues, or we are accelerating their creation or enhancing their creation. We capture those public revenues, and then that's what we invest into the project to make it happen through the tax increment financing. So I'm going to zip through a couple of these. This is market intervention. This is the Dahlia Square Shopping Center in Northeast Park Hill. This was once a thriving neighborhood retail center. It is located within a neighborhood, and so grocery stores, there's a reason why King Soopers wants to be where they are, because of that visibility right along Broadway. This is several blocks off of Martin Luther King Boulevard. As you can see, it has fallen into disrepair. This, ladies and gentlemen, is blight. We needed these slides when the legislature was talking about what they were talking about. So not only was it a large, buried, defunct shopping center, it was also situated on top of a methane-producing landfill. So again, talk about a market mismatch. No one was going to do anything with this property unless we were able to address that most fundamental challenge, which was the environmental contamination. So here is an overhead, an aerial of the site, so you can see it is sort of a super block there. So we worked with the city and with the federal government, and we were able to get a Section 108 loan from the city through HUD, and use that to remediate the soils, and we believed that we would be able to sell that clean and cleared site at an amount sufficient to repay that loan, so that then the vertical development could occur. The plan changed a number of times, so this was one of the early plans. This is not what the site looks like now, even though it does now have the Denver Health Clinic, rebuilt a clinic on the site. We also have senior affordable housing. So again, when you're talking about the population and the senior housing, one of the interesting things about this developer is when he said, because this is sort of his niche, he does senior affordable housing, and he said one of the things for our residents that is going to be important is a sense of security and having it be a gated community. And we thought, oh my gosh, the rest of the community is just going to go nuts at the idea of having this have any type of gating. We met with the community, again, going to actually really working with and communicating with the community, and they said, of course, if my mom is going to be living there, of course I wanted it to be a safe and secure place. And so, and it wasn't a big wall or anything, but it was very, very readily identified by the rest of the community as an appropriate ask. So that is an example of a complete market mismatch. This is an example of urban renewal as a catalyst. When we say make things happen faster, sometimes that means make it happen like in our lifetime. So this is the former Lowenstein Theater that was built as a theater, and it was very specific, therefore, in what it could be reused for. And it's a historic building and sat there vacant for a very long period of time. Developer saw an opportunity. It is located across from East High School. The Tattered Cover Bookstore no longer could afford their lease rate right in Cherry Creek, and so they were looking for a new home along a corridor that the City Council had identified as being a key corridor, that being Colfax. So the Lowenstein is on Colfax, and it has now been redeveloped. The part on the left there is the old theater building that is now home to Tattered Cover, and the tax increment was used to build a parking structure that is tucked behind the other retail uses that you see there, which was a great amenity not only for the retailers, but it also was very important to the community that lived right behind there as well, because they were very concerned that the additional traffic of people now coming to shop at Tattered Cover and the other meant that people were going to be parking in front of their houses, and they didn't want that impact. And so using the tax increment to build the structured parking was a good arrangement for the community as well as for the retailers. And then finally, and I am using this one very, very intentionally. So using it as an enhancement. So this is the redevelopment of the Gates factory site. So you want to talk about a TOD opportunity, there it is. You know, you have the convergence of the light rail lines. You are not far from downtown. Why wouldn't anybody want to snap this property up? Well, let's start with who owns it and why. And so Cherokee was the entity that had the property under contract. They no longer have it under contract. We did work with RTD. And there was a pretty bold development plan that was put in place, really trying to maximize density, bring forward amenities to provide connectivity from all parts of the city. So there were bridges across not only the railroad tracks, but also across Santa Fe to be able to provide the access. Now, in fairness to the development team, they did run into the recession, and that caused a whole lot of headache and heartache. We have an urban renewal area set in 2006. We started the clock on the tax increment, so it has been ticking ever since. The development was not able to move forward. This is what was envisioned as far as the density of the development, and instead it still pretty much looks like this today. So we don't always get it right. We'd like to think that we do, but we don't. And I just wanted to share a couple of things. When you're thinking about these areas from lessons learned on that site, that sometimes the market needs more than just location, location, location. That is a prime spot, but it still has a host of challenges, whether it's the environmental challenges, the connectivity challenges. But we're hearing that maybe there's developer interest again. Environmental issues, so I'm thrilled when you say brownfield that is not the environmental issues, that because they are almost always much more expensive than originally budgeted. And on this next bullet point, too many expectations can overwhelm a good project. And so when you were thinking about the game changer, think bold, but also there needs to be that market reality that comes into play, and use your developers in measuring that, and go back to those three circles. If the banks aren't wanting to lend against it, you should be cautious as well. So making sure that all of those things are in balance, and not overwhelming it with, gosh, if we could add this, and this, wouldn't that be fantastic? Because what we find, unfortunately, is those projects have a tendency just to sort of collapse under the weight of those expectations. And when using public finance, again, on Cherokee, it's really hard to push the reset button. We're quite frankly struggling trying to think about what we do now that, the 8 years of that clock have run and nothing is happening on that side. So when you look to use the tax increment, make sure that you are starting that clock right when you need to maximize the impact for you and the outcomes you're seeking. So, Dahlia, think about, even though it isn't as big, but think about, Dahlia Square. I think there's some transferability to the first area that we looked at, where you have the housing around, but then you have that whole, what is it that the community can really get behind and support from a development standpoint? When you think about the Lowenstein Theater, it was, again, one of those strategic investments, and then we're now seeing other development happen along both East Colfax as well as West Colfax, but somebody has to take that pioneering risk. And so being willing to work with the developer in addressing those first changes with the hope that with that change, that then begets more change, and then that area just sort of its own accord begins to come forward. And then when you look at the large infill areas, again, think about, how do you work with the development community, how do you work with the surrounding community to really maximize the opportunities that those very precious large infill sites provide to you. I just want to make one observation about this group, that I find it remarkable that it appears, unless I'm missing something, that you don't have really disparate ideas about what can and should happen. There may be some difference of opinion about the prioritization, but from a visioning of what Littleton needs, where those opportunities exist, feels to me as if you guys are walking down the same path and in the same direction, and that sometimes is half the battle, if not even more.
The question after that is, okay, at the highest level, we're not necessarily that far apart. Knowing that we may constrain things by getting too specific, how much farther can we go? And we have the chairman of the Urban Renewal Authorities in our midst as well, in case he had some questions or issues to maybe get us to the point so that we've created a workable environment to at least be moving forward. And then we'd also like to possibly be open to inviting you back at some point in time.
This was fun, of course, I'm happy to come back. I have a question of just a structure standpoint, because when we put forward an urban renewal plan, and it is a planning document, it sits on top of other existing city plans. So under statute, you have to find that the urban renewal plan is in conformance with the comp plan. Then in Denver, we have Blueprint Denver, which is the integrated land use and transportation plan, and then frequently there are neighborhood plans or station area plans. And then we set the urban renewal plan on top of all of those, trying to drill through to find the common objectives. Where do you, so consequently, we really look to our planning department as being the department that is responsible for undertaking all of those plans, and then city council adopts those as either supplements to the comp plan or sometimes not. Same structure here? So Denver right now is trying to decide, is it time to re-up our comp plan? Is your comp plan in pretty good shape?
Just updated. Just updated.
Okay, perfect, good, because we're behind on that.
It does, yeah.
Wow, what does that mean?
Well, let's still work on the neighborhood plans.
Yeah, so it's a comp plan, and then what they've got is some sub-area plans following that, like the Santa Fe corridor, et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah, because you and I sort of discussed that the other day. So which really comes first, the chicken or the egg? The neighborhood plans or renewal?
Neighborhood plans. Absolutely, Nick. That's why I made the point of the urban renewal plan sits on top of those other planning documents. Rare, if ever, is the day that the Urban Renewal Authority is the driving force in the development vision. We're the tool to implement it. So when we are looking to undertake a project, we were not the ones that went in and said, here's what should happen at Dahlia. And in fact, what the neighborhood wanted was a grocery store, and there were many, many, many challenging meetings helping them understand that we are not going to be able to bring a grocery store for all of the market-driven reasons. So with that, what else can we look to do? And so it was a much more community-driven exercise that was managed by the city's planning department, and then Public Works comes into play to the extent, we had to put a big, huge drainage pipe through the middle and everything else. But the Urban Renewal Authority in Denver is not the driving force in determining the outcome. We're the implementer of those visions put forward by the city, and we really, again, look to the efforts of the planning department.
Now, if a developer did come in and say, I want to do Woodlawn Shopping Center, and we don't have a neighborhood plan established there, certainly our door is open for business.
And it's so I'm going to share a story about another development site in Denver that you may or may not have heard about, the redevelopment of the former CU hospital campus at 9th and Colorado. We've had a number of challenges with that one. And it started, again, with a very intentional charrette process and planning process with the community that was, again, you need to have the sort of the reality that the planning department and others can bring to the exercise. And there was a development vision that was put forward that was mixed use, mix of incomes in the residential, some retail, some reuse of the buildings, not so much in other places. And it was a plan that the city embraced and the developer wanted to undertake and the community was supportive of. again, that darn recession, came into play, and that potential fell by the wayside. And then another developer came in and saw an opportunity to do a very different plan. And that was a almost entirely retail-driven plan that would have generated revenue for the city. But it was so different from that original plan that it wasn't too long before that plan started sort of bumping or kind of getting in its own way. And it was real apparent that, and in fact, I joked with Mayor Hancock and said that it was sort of like the ugly stepsister, right? We had the glass slipper, but now the stepsister came in and was trying to put her foot into that development, and it just didn't fit. Even though we desperately wanted something to happen on that site, it just didn't fit. And finally, we reached collectively a point where we said, this just doesn't fit. And now we are back to a plan that is much more consistent with that original plan. And so the point of that story is cautioning about doing something just for the sake of doing something, as opposed to, particularly if you're making the public investment, making sure that that something is consistent with that vision. Even if it's not the absolute perfect vision, hopefully it will be, getting you closer to what that may be. But if you don't, which I think is this, I think in large part the purpose of this exercise, and where I'm really heartened to hear the dialogue here, thinking about those things, even if you don't know exactly what they are, identifying things, we know what we don't want, we think we know what we want, and let's together with that development community figure out how to bring those things forward.
I think one of the, maybe it's a opportunity and also a challenge that Littleton has, is that when you look at the map, 3 of our largest parcels, 3 of our largest, 1, 6, and 2, are really bounded by Santa Fe and the river. And so there's not, so there really isn't what I would call neighborhoods. There are, because, somebody lives on the other side of Santa Fe, there's a railroad. So it's very different than something like 5 and 3, and even 4. Now 4 is challenging because while there's neighborhood, there's also another community, Inglewood, and then there's also some pretty intense asphalt lots. So while I agree that the neighborhood plans are important, we really if you're working on a neighborhood plan off a Ridge Road or over by Kettering Lake, then there's, how that affects the urban renewal or the plan we might be doing it at 1. Because any of the process we're doing with 1 is a complete public process anyway, and so everybody can weigh in. But in terms of, having that plan, how do you put that? What's your thinking on that?
Well, and that's the beauty of a city, right, is that you have these different areas that have different characters, and they have their unique strengths and challenges, and with that then come your unique opportunities as well. And so I'm not, if I'm hearing the question correctly, not concerned about the disparate existing land uses and the potentials that they bring forward, because you can look things, as you look across the city, there's always going to be those transition points to allow you to have that mix of commercial and retail and residential. So as and you can have an area plan that talks about each of those things. And I think sometimes if we talk about neighborhood plans in an area that isn't a neighborhood, so just, if it's an area plan as opposed to a neighborhood plan, can be helpful.
I think some of our old comp plans, neighborhood plans were pretty,
Oh, they're not going to change. Is that what you're saying?
they were really defined by that neighborhood. It wasn't.
Yeah, they're not going to change today.
The neighborhood?
The interior ones,
No.
we're really talking about Littleton Boulevard, Broadway, and Santa Fe. Yeah, the arterial.
How is the infrastructure overall? Is that, because I will say in Denver, that is a real development challenge, is both the age of the infrastructure and then the cost necessary to put in new. Is that a similar challenge?
Water and sewer is in good shape. Roads, we have a lot of deferred maintenance. Sidewalks, a lot of deferred maintenance. And then part of, just speaking for the Urban Renewal Authority, part of the action of bringing it forward now is because we do have developers who are starting to come forward and start to request and talk about this. So we are, without a doubt, behind the curve in terms of being prepared for this. The council is cognizant that over the last 18 months we've had more applications come through, and we've been trying to, the council just approved an update to the comp plan. I know Councilman Valdez has been pushing the planning board to get some of these sub-area plans done quickly for a lot of the reasons that you've articulated. Whether that timing works for us, we're not in a perfectly laid out time because the developer isn't waiting. Yeah, exactly. And so
Money's good now.
Yeah, money's good now, so trying to run all of these as concurrently and quickly as possible to ensure that we're setting ourselves up for maximum opportunity for success, because many of those sites, as you've heard tonight, fall into one of your three categories and will need some public assistance or may need some public assistance. So, and we may or may not have all of our ducks lined up and the stars lined up perfectly to make it happen, but that was the intent of tonight, was to start to create that vision in these different areas, as you're aware. So,
Jim, did you want to step up?
No, this is your meeting.
I'd suggest if the council and Tracy's amenable that we schedule her again so we can continue to drill down into this conversation. So, head nods and
Happy to.
great. Well,
Because
thank you.
this is the most rewarding, most challenging work that I think any of us can imagine. And in the role of the Urban Renewal Authority, where we, and I frequently describe it, my work this way to people, that you have one foot in the public sector, because that is what we are doing. We are building our city and rebuilding our city in many ways, and the other foot in the private sector, because that is who we look to be the builders, just like those circles put out. And sometimes, it's a pretty easy path, and other times it feels like we are stretched in completely different directions and trying to bring those back together in a way that is financially appropriate, always looking to the public benefit and the public outcome of our development, while still wanting to make sure that we don't make it so hard that the developers go somewhere else. It's tough, and it takes a long time. And again, going back to lower downtown or downtown Denver, I started at Dura in 1992, and our first project was the redevelopment of the Denver Dry Goods Building. And to be able to look at how that investment spurred other investment, that now rare is the occasion that we are working downtown. But then when you look at Stapleton or Lowry and other areas that deal with many of the same challenges, because they are different neighborhoods and different communities and different challenges. But when you're able to look up and look at the Millennial Park and the Central Platte Valley, which we didn't do hardly anything down there, but I think part of the other investment in downtown, helped stimulate, and you're able to look back, goodness, 25 years later and realize, how effective you have been in both setting that vision as well as implementing it. That's a pretty good feeling.
Was there authority up in Highlands?
There is an urban renewal area in Highlands that is, the boundaries were the former Elitch's amusement park site. So there were some, so there's an urban renewal area there that, again, we had a big gaping hole, and I joke about that being job security, because we helped move the Elitch's into the Central Platte Valley, and we also had to figure out how to fill in the hole that was there. But But there was already change happening in the Highlands neighborhood, in large part because of the taking down of the viaducts and then the bridges that were built across. Those public investments, I think, were a really long way in beginning to change the look and feel and development desirability of the area.
And our promise is to have you work with city staff to reschedule or schedule more.
Happy to do that.
And thank you so much for stimulating our thinking tonight and keeping us on track.
You're welcome, and happy to be a citizen and being able to share some of the other stuff as well. So this is exciting stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.